Welcome to the Cumbria Chamber of Commerce podcast, your regular update of business news and issues from around Cumbria. Find out how we support new business and help existing businesses to grow and flourish at cumbriachamber.co.uk. Now here's the Chamber's Business Engagement Manager, Julian Whittle, with the latest episode.
Hello, welcome to the second of three podcasts we're recording with Cumbrian candidates standing in the general election. I'm here with John Stevenson, who is campaigning to be re-elected as the Conservative MP for Carlisle. John was first elected in 2010. He's a lawyer by profession and has an interest in business issues. He hosts the annual Carlisle Skills Fair and the Cumbria Nuclear Conference. He's a champion of the Borderlands Growth Deal and chairs the all-party parliamentary groups for food and drink, the West Coast Main Line and family businesses. And he's a member of the all-party parliamentary group on the nuclear industry. John, the Conservative campaign could be summed up probably in three words: get Brexit done. It's plastered on the front of your manifesto, and it's certainly been the theme when I've heard Boris Johnson speaking. It won't be done, though, will it? Not in January. And if we leave the EU in January with the newly negotiated withdrawal agreement, we start trade talks. What sort of future trading relationship with the EU would you like to see?
Well, first of all, this is an election that is about Brexit, and yes, there are other issues, and it's very important that we do discuss those other issues, but we have to recognise, to a very large extent, this election is a reflection on the fact that Parliament was incapable of implementing the decision of the referendum in 2016. So if we assume, and I hope, that the Conservatives do get re-elected with a working majority, I think we can take it that we will leave the EU at the end of January, although we will still be part of the trading bloc as per the deal that has been agreed, and we will then be looking to the future. And I think the strategy that the government wants to have is to reach an agreement with the EU as quickly as possible, and in many respects that should be relatively easy in the sense that we are already aligned with the EU in terms of tariffs and regulation, and therefore any deal is about how you diverge from the existing agreement rather than reaching an actual agreement. So it's a slightly unusual trade agreement. And then it gives us the opportunity to look across the world to other alternative trading partners. We already have very good trading relationships with places like America, Canada, Australia, etc. And I think we will be looking to cement those and indeed improve upon them.
So what sort of trading relationship with the EU would you like to see at the end of the negotiations?
Well, I think we've got to be careful that we do continue to have a very close relationship. It's 44% of our export market. It's our biggest trading bloc, although the United States is our biggest trading partner. And we've quite clearly got many of our industries integrated into the European system. So we're quite clearly going to need a close relationship with them. But I think at the same time, what we do want to see is an ability to reach other alternative agreements with other of the major trading blocs throughout the world.
Well, the manifesto talks about leaving the single market and the customs union. Now, I remember when you spoke at a chamber lunch, actually almost exactly a year ago, you were making the case for the Norway model, which would have kept the UK in the single market. Is that still your view? Has your view changed then?
At that time, I was very much supportive of remaining within the single market. I completely get we had to leave the customs union because that would have prevented us doing trade deals. I would still like to see us having a very close relationship with the single market because of the points I've already said about the closeness of our geography and our businesses. So I'm still very much of that. I wouldn't say I've changed my mind dramatically, but I do reflect that in Parliament we had a series of indicative votes and I lost the argument. And when you lose your argument in a democracy, you have to accept that result and look forward to what other agreements can be reached. Right. So I do want to see us having a close relationship with Europe because I think it would be nonsensical for us not to. But at the same time, I want us to seize the other opportunities that there are.
Now, the government is adamant that trade talks will be concluded by the end of next year. In fact, the manifesto is explicit. It says we will not extend the implementation period beyond the end of 2020. Now, if we get to the end of 2020 and we haven't concluded a trade agreement by then, would you be comfortable with us leaving effectively on no deal terms, WTO terms, or would you favour an extension to the transition so that the talks could carry on?
Well, that's very much a hypothetical question, and dare I say slightly negative, because I actually think it should be relatively easy to reach agreement.
Well, a lot of people, with respect, a lot of people who are experts on trade negotiations think it's a very tight timetable and possibly very optimistic to think that it can be done.
I think it's accepted that it's a tight timetable, but you also have to look at the unusual circumstances we are in. Most trade agreements are about reducing tariffs and aligning regulation. We're already aligned. So therefore our trade agreement that we'll have with the EU is more about divergence and the procedures that you would follow for that. So it should, in many respects, be relatively straightforward in comparison with other trade agreements. So I think there's no reason why we shouldn't be ambitious to try and get it done by the end of 2020. I think actually it's in the interest of our country, and it's certainly in the interest of the EU, because quite clearly they want to move on to discuss other things.
Okay.
So therefore I take a positive view on this.
Okay, it's fair enough aspiration, but you must accept that you can't guarantee that it can be achieved. So if we get to the end of 2020 and we haven't got a new trading arrangement thrashed out, should we extend the transition, or would you be happy to go out on WTO terms?
Again, I'd say that's very much a hypothetical question. And I'm reluctant to get into discussing hypothetical questions, because you can end up in all sorts of places with that. I think we've got to view it in a positive way. We will leave at the end of January. There's no reason why we shouldn't achieve an agreement with the EU by the end of 2020.
No, we'll let listeners make up their own mind on that one, and then on what they think you mean. The manifesto outlines plans for an Australian-style point system for immigration post-Brexit. I note there's talk about attracting the brightest and the best. And the Migration Advisory Committee has actually suggested a $30,000 a year salary floor for migrants coming in. Now, that would rule out not necessarily unskilled, but lower skilled workers. Now, in Cumbria, and in your constituency, the foods processing sector is dependent, and of course in the Lake District the hospitality sector is very dependent on migrant workers. We did some research on this back in 2017 as a chamber, and we came across hotels who were saying, well, 65% of our workforce is made up of EU migrants, and they actually told us they were worried they might have to shut if they couldn't carry on recruiting them. What do you say to businesses like that?
Well, there's two aspects to this. There's about the general overarching policy and the specifics. And interesting enough, when that £30,000 threshold came out, I went straight away to see the immigration minister and tried to point out to her that actually this would be detrimental to Cumbria.
Yeah.
And I think it's recognised by many within government that actually they're going to have a greater degree of flexibility if they are to make sure that economies such as Cumbria, and there are other parts of the country who are in a similar position, to ensure that we do have the workforce that we need to make sure that those industries can function properly. So I welcome the idea of a thought-through immigration system, but at the same time it has to have flexibility in it. And already the government's demonstrating that by their flexibility with regards to NHS staff. So I foresee that what you'll have is particular requirements for particular industries in different parts of the country. So I would think it'll be flexible, but at the same time does give us a framework.
Yeah, I mean, there was talk of flexibility for agriculture and horticulture, but not, say, for hospitality. So you think that there might be movement on that one?
I think almost certainly there will have to be, because it is a huge amount of employment is within the hospitality industry, and it's very important to Cumbria.
Now, the UK economy just about avoided recession this year, but we know through surveys that we contribute to, that the British Chambers of Commerce does, that I suppose confidence is perhaps fragile is the word at the moment that you could say. And a big issue for businesses is rising costs. Now, you're proposing to raise the national living wage from £8.21 an hour to £10.50 by 2024. That's a 28% increase. And also extend the scope to everyone over 21 rather than over 25. Aren't you worried that this could be the last straw? Because, I mean, it's not just the workers on the minimum, because when you raise the minimum, the differentials for people who are already just above the minimum, there's pressure on employers to raise their pay as well. And obviously some sectors are more exposed to this than others. And one of the sectors that employs a lot of workers on the minimum wage is retail. And they're already facing pressures from online competition and so on. Are you not worried that sort of increase will be the last straw for some of these retail businesses?
Well, firstly, you ask a question about the general state of the economy, and it's undoubtedly slowed down in the course of the last year. And I think a lot of that is to do with confidence and uncertainty over Brexit. And one of the pluses I foresee is that if we can get a Conservative majority, we can clearly leave at the end of January, and then I think greater certainty will be created, and therefore investment businesses, which will help the general economy.
Eventually, probably not straight away, because we would need to get the trade talks done. Otherwise, you've still got the uncertainty of what happens at the end of 2020, haven't you?
But I think there'll be a feeling that rather than this high-octane political discourse that there has been for the last 3 years, it'll go down to the more technical level and trade talks. And I think that will allow businesses to have greater confidence and start to invest. But on the specifics about salaries and wages, yes, it will put some pressure on businesses, but I think we've also got to recognise the contribution that people make to those businesses. And we want to ensure that people have the ability to live off the wage that they obtain, rather than always having to get, say, tax credits or that in support of that, although that is very important for those who maybe are on part-time work. And I don't think it's unreasonable to ask employers to pay their staff at a level that the economy can cope with. And I think when the minimum wage first came in, there was a great deal of concern that it would actually push up unemployment, and it didn't. And in actual fact, one of the great successes of the last 9 years has seen the employment rate drop from just under 8% to under 4%. So quite clearly, employers have not been put off by the amount they have to pay staff, and long may that continue.
One cost that really squeezes businesses, and still on that retail theme, of course, is business rates. Now, there's a welcome pledge in the manifesto to reduce business rates, and there's a promise of going to quote the manifesto directly, a fundamental review of the system. Well, the only problem with that is I remember George Osborne promising exactly the same thing in the 2014 autumn statement, and we're still saddled with the same business rate system. Why should businesses believe you this time?
Well, businesses have already received substantial support at the lower end, so the smaller business has already seen. Many businesses don't actually pay business rates, so that's a help for the smaller business. And I think it's recognised that the business rate system is not functioning properly, although we always have to be aware it does actually bring in a substantial amount of tax. And I think any government, particularly in the present circumstance, will have to accept that they will want to raise a very similar amount. But it's got to be fair, and it's got to be in such a way that it doesn't disencourage businesses. So I welcome the comprehensive review, and I think actually any new government should get on with that ASAP, so that we can see a change to the business rate system that actually makes it fairer and allows businesses to flourish.
I think businesses, well, again, this is from surveys that we've done, that the chamber members rather very keen to see additional investment in infrastructure, and there's £100 billion pledge for infrastructure spending. Although I know there's no commitment still on HS2, we're awaiting the outcome of the review. I wondered what infrastructures would you like to see come forward in this area? Which infrastructure projects rather would you like to see come forward in this area?
Well, being more parochial and look at the Cumbria wide and indeed Carlisle wide, you've already started to see some. We've got the Garden Village announcement, 10,000 new houses, which will allow Carlisle to expand. And on the back of that, we've got the Southern Ring Road, £100 million investment, a significant amount of money into our area, which will help Carlisle, but also across to West Cumbria. You've already seen two likely improvements to the A595. There's commitment to the A66, and there are some discussions now with regards to the A69. So there's quite a lot of discussion about road infrastructure going on. We're fortunate that we've had the commercial flights out to Carlisle Airport for the first time in 25 years, which I think was welcome. And we've also got to look at digital infrastructure. So there's a variety of things we want to see. The Borderlands Growth Initiative has also been, I think, a driver for change. So you're going to see 16 million pounds invested into our railway station, and there will be other infrastructure projects surrounding the region. But I think infrastructure is very, very important, and I think all governments to a certain extent, but certainly the Conservative Party, has recognised that if we are really to rebalance the economy, if we are really to change the economic dynamics of our country, we need serious infrastructure investment in the north of England, as well as in the south of England, so that we can see a rebalancing of the economy and an improvement in the economic performance of the north.
Okay. I mean, there's also a specific pledge to reinstate some of the railways that were closed by beaching in the 1960s. I wondered, are there any in Cumbria you think that should be reopened?
Well, part of the Borderlands Growth Initiative, we have the feasibility study, £10 million committed to the Waverley line, which would improve the connectivity between Carlisle and Edinburgh. And I think that, in particular, this part of the region is seen as the priority. So that's a welcome development. I think the government's got to make sure that where it does invest, it invests in a way that will bring real benefit. And that's one of the reasons, if we go back to roads, I've been a strong advocate of improving the A689 because it links in with the airport, and it would also, from a safety perspective, take away traffic along the 69, but it drives the economy of our region. And I think that's very important when you have these infrastructure projects. Will they bring a real benefit to that region?
Okay. One of the feedback we get from employees is that they often have difficulty recruiting staff, or the difficulties are compounded by the lack of public transport, especially buses. Now, how is it right that buses in London get an annual subsidy of £722 million and Cumbrian buses get nothing?
This is probably one of the most challenging elements of transport policy, particularly for areas like Cumbria, which are very rural and small populations. I mean,
I'd have thought that a rural area with sparsity would need a subsidy more than a city.
Well, I think you've got to look at numbers to some extent here. London has 10 million people living in and around big cities. So therefore, its public transport network is far more integrated, far more sophisticated. Yes, you're absolutely right. It would be nice to see some of our own transport network in Cumbria. Difficulty is how many people are using it. Will they use it? How do we encourage people to use it? And I think that is one of the biggest challenges, because if you knew people were going to use it, I think it would be far easier to subsidise it. But there's no point in subsidising a bus which nobody is actually using. And that is the challenge for our rural communities. But yes, I think everybody recognises that there is difficulties there.
But I'm wondering, is that example symptomatic of areas of the north getting a raw deal? Take another example would be flood defences, which is a big issue, obviously, in your constituency. The southeast of England has 32% of the population of England, but it gets 60% of the money spent on flood defences.
I think we've got to be careful that we don't start just calling London and complaining. We've actually got to be proactive and look at what we can achieve and what we can do. And I think, yes, investment goes into the south of England, but what we want to do is encourage government to put the equivalent, if indeed not more, into our area. And I think that political agenda is emerging, in that I think that my government and my party have now recognised that if we are, I go back to my point about rebalancing the economy, that we actually have to see a greater investment into the northern regions. On flooding specifically, we haven't done badly in this part of the world. We got 38 million after the flood in 2005, and there's a commitment to a further 25 million in 2000 and after the 2015 floods, and that is now starting to happen. And the government, or the Conservative Party, is now committing in its manifesto to additional £4 billion of investment into flood defences, and I suspect much of that will end up going into the north. But I think we've got to be very careful about whinging about what the south gets. It's far more important that we actually concentrate on what we can get, lobbying hard, making sure that we do get our fair share, and making sure that when we do get it, we make it work for us.
Now, we touched on recruitment difficulties that businesses have, and it's compounded by the fact that our working age population in Cumbria is actually shrinking. And one solution, obviously, is to attract younger people to move into the county and make their home here. Now, there's a target in the manifesto of building 300,000 homes a year by the mid-2020s, but how do you ensure that they're built where they're needed and that they're actually affordable?
I think this is one of the big challenges for Cumbria as a county. And when I got elected in 2010, I made the call to see my city grow. And I think I would say that exactly the same for Cumbria. We actually need more people to come and live and work in our county. There are certain parts of the county where housing is challenging. Lake Districts are sort of a unique set of circumstances. In Carlisle, it's very different. We do have the planning permissions. We do have the ability to build. I don't think there's the same resistance to building. So I think from a housing perspective, actually Carlisle and much of Cumbria, if I exclude the Lake District, is actually well placed. Our difficulty and our challenge is to get businesses and to get people to move into our county. So they actually want to come here and live and work, put down their roots, etc. And I think that is probably one of the most difficult elements for us as politicians and as policymakers. How do we attract people into our region? And when we did the Borderlands Growth Initiative, in many respects, that's what the government was saying to us. What investment can we put into the Borderlands region that will help the Borderlands area grow, but at the same time bring in and attract a greater numbers of people to come and live and work here?
Okay. Another issue is skills. There's a £3 billion National Skills Fund in the manifesto, and it actually says we expect to train up hundreds of thousands more highly skilled apprentices. But the reality is that the number of apprenticeship starts is actually falling. I think it was a 23% fall in the number of new apprenticeship starts in Cumbria last year. How are you going to reverse that?
I think interestingly enough, the apprenticeship concept, schemes, etc., have been one of the great successes of the coalition government. Up until then, it would appear that anybody who went to university was treated differently and considered to be more worthwhile than somebody who had gone straight into a job or an apprentice. And I think that balance has changed, and I think in a very positive way and for the right reasons. In this part of the world, our businesses, I think, in many respects, need less graduates and more trained technicians, electricians, apprentice-type
STEM skills.
STEM skills, yes, you're absolutely right. And we need those for our economy. So we've got to try and encourage employers to take on apprentices. And sometimes I often think if one business has an apprentice, they shouldn't see when they lose that apprentice to another business as a bad thing. What we've got to do is increase the pool right across the board, which will help all businesses in all industries. So I'm very supportive of the apprenticeship schemes. One of the reasons I do the skills fair, and we've done it now for 6 years, is to attract businesses, these training providers, and those looking for those job opportunities, those apprentices. And it's worked incredibly well, and it's been very, very popular.
So why do you think the number of apprenticeship starts is falling?
Straight answer, I don't actually know. I think that would be a conversation with the training providers and the employers. It may well be the numbers have dropped in terms of are the number of apprenticeships available. I don't know the actual reasons for that, but what I do know and what I do recognise is the importance of apprenticeships. And I think the wider public, I think business have recognised it, the public have recognised it, and I think school pupils now see it as a real alternative to going to university, and I think that's extremely healthy.
Okay. Now, the 2017 Conservative Manifesto announced plans for a UK Shared Prosperity Fund to replace the EU structural funds. It's mentioned again in the 2019 Manifesto, but we still don't know how it would work. I mean, a consultation was originally supposed to begin a year ago, but we're still waiting for that. How would you design the fund to ensure that Cumbria, and particularly Cumbrian businesses, get the full benefit?
Well, this is, I think, a £2.1 billion fund that has been available through the European Union for the last decade or so. First of all, I'm pleased the government's committed, or the Conservative Party is committed to creating an equivalent sort of fund for British and industry. How we need to do it in this part, very, very simply in actual fact, and it came out again in the Borderlands growth discussions, we've got to play as a team. So it shouldn't be one authority, it shouldn't be one business. We should get together and say, right, Cumbria or the Borderlands region is going to come together with an application to government for the support that we need in our region and in our county. And I think that would be far more effective. I think one of the mistakes we've made in Cumbria is sometimes not playing all on the same side. Manchester's been very good at it.
Yeah.
They would have their discussion internally, but then when they went to government, they would present a united front. And I think that's been one of our mistakes in Cumbria, that we haven't been able to present that united front. And I think something like the Shared Prosperity Fund gives us that opportunity to do so, and that is how I would suggest that we were to play it.
Okay.
And interesting, if I may just sort of digress slightly, but it's on a similar theme about Cumbria playing as on a sort of united front in one team, is within the manifesto there's a commitment to a white paper on devolution and infrastructure for the north of England. And I would anticipate through that Cumbria having a real opportunity to seriously look at local government, devolution, and what we do in our county, because it's not working at present. It hasn't worked for many, many years. And as you well know, I've long been an advocate for change.
Yes, you've always argued that we need unitary local government. And that this could be a way of...
Absolutely. And I think if we were to get, whether it's one or two unitaries, I personally prefer two, and maybe an elected mayor as well for Cumbria, we would then have a much better system where we can then go to government saying this is what we need for our county, and have a united front and applying for that and lobbying in the correct way.
Okay. I mean, I've been studying all the parties' manifestos, and there's one area where there is a degree of similarity in that there's a strong green element in all of them, although obviously differences in the way it's delivered. You've got a big commitment to tree planting, an ambition already set of net zero carbon emissions by 2050, a rollout of green energy infrastructure. But National Grid is forecasting that because of this, because particularly of the extra demand from electric vehicles, and also possibly a switch away from fossil fuels for domestic heating, because of this, UK generating capacity, electricity generating capacity, will actually have to double by 2050. Now, the manifesto makes one rather cursory reference to nuclear, and in fact, it seems to be talking about fusion, which of course is still an unproven technology. There's nothing about conventional nuclear new build. There's nothing about small modular reactors. There's no mention either of tidal power, which has great potential in Cumbria. I mean, are you disappointed that there isn't more emphasis on nuclear and perhaps tidal? Aren't we going to need them both if we are going to meet that 2050 target?
Well, as a general observation first, I think there's a growing cross-party consensus that it is probably one of the biggest issues of our age, and that we need to be addressing it. And there have been some successes. Since 1990, we've cut emissions by about 40%, while the economy has grown by about 2/3. And since 2010, renewable generation has risen from 6.1% to 37%. So that's demonstrating some success. But I take your point about increased capacity for electricity. And quite clear we're going to have to produce more electricity if we are moving to a more low carbon economy. How do we achieve that? My view, and it's a long held view, is we have to have nuclear. It provide the base supply. I was very disappointed that we didn't go ahead with the Moorside development. Personally, I think it was a missed opportunity by government. And I actually think that both political parties have to come to some sort of cross-party consensus, because nuclear is an investment for many, many years. It goes well beyond one government and several parliaments. But I think it's going to be central to our change to a low-carbon economy.
So what needs to change then to kickstart nuclear? Because it's not just Moorside, of course. The Horizon project in Wales also found it, didn't it? So
yes, I mean, this is a personal view. I actually think government is going to actually have to invest in nuclear. It's going to have to take a stake. And that's what I advocated with Moorside. That the government should have taken, a 20% stake. It could have partnered with the South Koreans as it was then. They could have done the equivalent in Wilfa. And that, I think, would have started to underpin the industry. It would have given greater confidence. And we could have started to build nuclear plants and use the skills that we have in this country, and particularly in our own county.
They did actually offer to take a stake in Wilfa, but obviously it wasn't enough to get Adachi to commit to it. Yeah.
But I think they should have done a similar idea for West Cumbria. And interesting, just while we're talking about renewals, I came second in the ballot for private members' bills, and unfortunately our Parliament was brought to an end more quickly than anticipated. But had I had the opportunity to present a bill, the bill I was going to take before Parliament was to make solar power panels compulsory for all new residential builds. And I think that's a way of helping fuel poverty. It's a very simple way, without causing any cost to the exchequer, of improving our electricity supply on individual properties. And if you're building 200,000 a year, you immediately have a market which will drive down the price. Innovation will kick in, and you could have a very healthy solar panel market.
Okay. One final question, John. Are you going to predict the outcome of the election?
Politicians never do such things.
Wow.
I never take anything for granted. Carlisle has been a marginal seat, as you well know, for many, many years. Yeah. I suspect it will continue to do so. And in many respects, it's healthy for the local voters because it keeps me on my toes.
What about nationally, though?
I'll be disappointed if the Conservatives don't get a majority. I actually think the country needs a majority government. We've seen what's happened with a hung parliament. It hasn't been particularly edifying. I think this moment in time, this country needs a Conservative majority that can get on with Brexit, get that out of the way, and move on to the more traditional issues that I think matter to everyone.
Thanks very much, John.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Cumbria Chamber of Commerce podcast. You can find out more about how we're supporting Cumbrian businesses at cumbriachamber.co.uk and cumbriagrowthhub.co.uk. In the meantime, thank you very much for listening, and watch out for the next episode, which we'll be releasing very soon.